Hello again. My name is Bianca Morrow, and I would like to welcome you to the third webinar in our Inclusion 101 series entitled Inclusive Digital Space for the Well-Meaning, Well-Doing, and the Well-Clueless. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. Before we begin, I'd like to urge you, if you have not done so already, to take some time today to learn about the history of Juneteenth, and then talk about what you've learned with your family and especially any young and school-age children in your life. These conversations can be very difficult, but are also very important. Please seek out the many resources that are available online to help you facilitate this. Today's presentation topic is accessible virtual spaces, meetings, conferences, and dance classes. Here with me are Maxine Farkas, Chair of the Lowell Cultural Council, who without her, this would not be possible, and the presenter and author of this series, Carrie Thompson. Carrie has been a champion for the inclusion of people with disabilities in the arts and culture sector. As the Executive Director for Silent Rhythms, she has taught more than 5,000 people with disabilities how to dance, and has taught countless more people without disabilities how to include those people with disabilities in the arts and in our community through events such as Lowell and Boston's Salsa in the Park. She's joining us today to share her knowledge and expertise on how to make our community even more inclusive, especially during the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us again, Carrie, and they're all yours.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Maxine. Thank you, all of you, for being here once again. We know that today is a time to celebrate the abolishment of slavery in the United States on this Juneteenth. We know that slavery may be illegal, but people of color are still not free. We have all taken our freedom for granted, including myself, and the pandemic has us all looking at our freedom in terms of what does it mean for ourselves, what does it mean for others, and thinking about freedom before the pandemic and thinking about what freedom means now during the pandemic and what it will look like after the pandemic. The right to free speech, the right to peaceful assembly, the right of movement, the right to information. These rights are also a disability rights issue and a human rights issue. I have mentioned throughout these webinars that disability rights is a human rights issue, that access to the arts and access to information are both covered by domestic legislation and international treaties. I mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a few times, and right now I feel compelled to share one of the articles in the Declaration. It's one of my favorites. Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. What does this message have to do with today's session on creating inclusive and accessible events? Because for many people with disabilities, freedom of movement and the right to information are a daily struggle. The pandemic has created even bigger physical and communication barriers than ever before. For all of you being here, you give me hope that our society can change and that your eyes will be open, your ears will be ready to listen, and your mind will be open to think in a different way. Next slide, please. So once again, I'm sharing the credentials that Bianca already mentioned, and I include the website for Silent Rhythm, and I include the website for Disability Rights Fund, another organization that I work for to advance human rights for people with disabilities. And there is a picture on the right side. During the first webinar, I define the way people approach disability issues as those who are well-meaning, well-doing, and the well, clueless. Someone asked me to give an example of those who are well-doing, and I gave the example from Wheelock Family Theater. Wheelock Family Theater in 2013 was looking for a deaf dancer to be part of the Pippi Longstocking production. They wanted to have an angel mama be someone who was deaf. This would be Pippi Longstocking's mother. They couldn't find a deaf dancer, and then they asked me. I'm not an actress. I don't consider myself an actress. But when they approached me, I thought, this sounds like a great opportunity to showcase my dance talent, as well as to teach about being inclusive and accessible. But I told them, I'm nervous about doing this. And why am I nervous? It's because I'm not just deaf, I'm also blind. I was afraid to navigate the space on the stage, going from one side to the other and not knowing what's in front of me, especially when the lights were dark. And I told them this, and they just said, well, let's think about this. So what they did was, there's a big giant moon. I don't think it's in the picture, but it's right above my head. The moon has a piece of rope that is part of the nautical theme. I'm holding the end of the rope. Someone backstage is pulling the moon across the stage, and that, while I'm holding the rope, is helping to guide me forward. At the same time, there were a couple of props on the stage before my scene, and so the way to move those out of the way, they decided to have the thieves who were in Pippi Longstocking's house steal the props and run off stage. So this was a way that they were trying to be inclusive and accessible. And people say that that scene was one of their favorite because the other way of not just me coming on the stage, but the way I left the stage was very powerful, because we had Pippi Longstocking and myself dancing, and Pippi says, I miss Papa. So Papa Longstocking comes on stage, and the three of us dance together. Then Papa Longstocking and I slowly dance off the stage. So people don't realize that all of this was a way to help me navigate the stage. To the audience, it was just very powerful. So including me in that production just required a little creativity and teamwork. For many who saw that play, they started to think about people with disabilities and people who were deafblind in a different way. And before we begin, I also want to point out that today's topic is about accessible virtual meetings. And I want to point out that we are in an accessible virtual meeting right now, as we have the option for closed captioning. If you see it at the bottom right, there's the closed caption icon. We also have an American Sign Language interpreter. And if you need to focus on her video, you just pin the video. So the next slide, please. There's 4 things that I'm going to be covering today. One is making events accessible and inclusive. 2, the physical versus online events. What's the same and what's different? 3, accessible virtual meeting. And the last one is accessible virtual dance classes. That sounds like it's impossible, but I will teach you how to do that. I also want to point out that I put less information on these PowerPoint slides, even though I have quite a bit to tell you. The reason why I did not put so much information was because I wanted you to focus on how this PowerPoint is being conducted, how I'm describing images, and I neglected to describe the image previously showing me within my costume for Pippi Longstocking. So let me go back to that slide one more time, if you can. One more. One more. Can you go to the one that has the picture of Pippi Longstocking? Thank you. Okay, this one, yes. So I want to describe the image. So you see me, a white woman, with long brown hair. I'm wearing a flamenco style outfit, and my top is red, and the layers of my skirt are red, yellow, and purple. And I am moving my hands towards the sky off in the distance. The background is in gray and blue to have sort of a nautical theme. So I want to point out that PowerPoints and screen shares are not accessible for those who are using a screen reader. So as you observe my way of presenting information, notice that I will take the time to describe images and to read the text that's on the PowerPoint in front of me. I also want you to look at the format of the slides that I'm using. I'm using a dark background because a dark background with light colored font are supposed to be easier on the eyes and easier for people with visual impairments. In general, it's also good for everyone because a darker background actually is easier for everyone's eyes and gives you less headaches and keeps you more engaged than having a white background. Scientists have confirmed it. Okay, so thank you for your patience and going back through a bunch of slides. So let's go back a couple more slides to slide 4, making events accessible and inclusive. Perfect, this is where we are. So these tips cover both physical and online events. You need to think about accessibility and inclusion in 4 phases: before the event, setting up the event space, during the event, and then after the event. So before the meeting, a good bulk of the work that you're going to be doing to create an accessible event happens before. So the first thing you should be doing is send out a questionnaire to those attending a large meeting or conference, asking them about their access needs. Then ensure any online registration includes a line for requesting accessibility accommodations. Because a lot of times I see an event and think, that sounds like a great event. I wonder if they have captioning or an interpreter, and there's no way for me to find out how I can contact the organization directly and make this request. So that's something to do to ensure that if anyone is registering for an event, that there's a line about what accessibility options will be provided, as well as to have a contact information if you have questions or other needs. Determine who on the team will be responsible for coordinating accessibility accommodations. Next, request language interpreters and captioners, which is also known as a CART provider, captioning in real time. Please request these as early as possible, even though right now there are not a lot of in-person meetings. Many interpreters and captioners are as busy as ever, so it's always important to try to book them as early as possible. Secure accessible venue. So this is if you were having a physical meeting to verify that the building has an elevator, has a ramp, and accessible bathroom. Now, another thing to do before the meeting is to follow up with the individual on their specific needs and ask, if they have any specific preferences. Sometimes they might even have a preference for a specific sign language interpreter or captioner. You do want to give people that opportunity to let you know what they prefer. The next thing to do is to share any meeting material with the sign language interpreter and the captioners ahead of time. Support providers may not be familiar with your field terminologies and acronyms, so try to share a list of acronyms and terms that will be frequently used during your meeting. And I will give you a lesson learned from myself. When I first started working at Disability Rights Fund 12 years ago, I myself was not familiar with all the terms and acronyms they were going to be using. So I had a captioner who was captioning a meeting, and they were talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD for short. So the captioner, when she heard CRPD, she put in shorthand CRPD, but it came up crap. So I will never forget the sentence that was spoken 12 years ago. And this is what the captioner said. The importance of crap is that it has the power to push things forward. Something's getting pushed, all right. So lesson learned, share your acronym list ahead of time. Another tip to do before the meeting is to ask the presenter to provide materials before the meeting to allow for alternate formats to be created. So sometimes you want to save all of these meeting material on a USB drive or a thumb drive. Why do you want to do that? Because sometimes people will always ask you during the meeting, can you please send me an email with that attachment? And at the time, you're thinking, I don't know where that document is. I need to find it, and you're searching for it. Having a thumb drive ready in your hand, you can say, sure, here's my thumb drive, and plug it into their computer. And of course, try to be ready with an email draft that has some of these attachments. I already mentioned that use a PowerPoint template that is low vision friendly, such as a dark background. It can be black, it can be dark gray or navy, and light colors such as white or yellow. Try to use large size and limit the amount of text that are on the PowerPoint, such as I'm doing right now, just having a few points. If you need to use Braille for somebody, ask a Braille company, such as the Perkins School for the Blind, if how much time they might need to Braille the material. And please note that some documents cannot be Braille, such as tables, charts, and PDF. So always try to provide a Word version. If you have a photographer at your event, ask them to focus on the person, not the disability, such as don't focus on the hearing aid, don't focus on the wheelchair, but focus on the person. I cannot tell you how many times my own white cane has been photographed, and I feel like it's time for my white cane to have its own Instagram page. It's more famous than I am. So another point to do is meet with your staff and volunteers prior to the meeting to make sure everyone is familiar with how to be inclusive and how to be accessible. I am sure right now all of you are thinking, this is a sign for overwhelm, throwing your hands over your head. It seems overwhelming to do all of these, but the good thing is now you got to this point, you've done most of the work already, and the more you do this, it becomes a second nature, and it's so fluid and it flows so much easier the more you do it. Okay, so the second phase of creating an accessible and inclusive meeting, setting up the meeting room. Offer the option of a person with a disability to arrive early to determine their best area for their needs. Reserve seating near speakers for sign language interpreters and captioners so that they can hear the best sound quality. Ensure that wheelchair users and those with visual impairment will be able to navigate around the room. You want enough width between one table and another table, as well as chairs. A lot of times I go to conferences and people sit in their chair, they get up and they push their chairs out of the way. I always tell people, everyone push your chairs in, because suddenly you create a roadblock for somebody who's trying to get from one side of the room with all these chairs that have been pushed out. Another thing to do during the event is to ensure speakers with disabilities have access to the podium and the panel table. Sometimes the venue might have an upraised platform that are only accessible by steps. So you want to make sure that they have a ramp, or just to have the podium on the floor, on the ground floor at the same level as everyone else. Print copies of materials for the sign language interpreters and guides so that they can see the information you're talking about next to them. Okay. The next thing, the third phase is now during the meeting. Ask those in the room to introduce themselves. This helps those who are visually impaired as they listen, and Bob will introduce himself, and then Diana will introduce herself, then Rachel will introduce herself. The person with a visual impairment is not only hearing who is there, but they can hear where they are in the room, who is on the right side and who is on the left side. Please refrain from asking interpreters and captioners to introduce themselves, because when you do that, you disrupt them from the work that they're trying to provide in the moment. It's more than appropriate to say thank you to all the captioners and sign language interpreters for supporting the event. Before beginning the meeting, have the moderator outline communication access rules, such as 1, wait for the moderator to call on you if you have a question or comment to prevent overlapping chatter, because when too many people are talking, the captioner cannot caption that, and sign language interpreters are like blah 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 boop boop boop. So if you happen to look at my video, I was doing like open mouth, open mouth, open mouth, 2 open mouths going back and forth. Say your name before stating your comment, because once again, this is helpful for those with visual impairment, and also it's helpful for those interpreters and captioners to understand the name of the person who is speaking, as well as if they don't know that person. So not everyone knows who Bob is. So you want to make sure that Bob says, "Hi everyone, this is Bob. I have a question for Carrie." Okay, so now we're at the third phase after the meeting. Debrief with your team to discuss what went well and your lesson learned. Did you have a CIPD/crap moment? Send out a survey to include questions about the accessibility. A lot of times, events often send out a survey to ask for feedback, but those never include any questions about accessibility. So you want to make sure that if you provided accommodation for accessibility, you want to make sure that the very people who you intended it for thought it was effective. They may have other suggestions to do even better for the future. So now we're going to the next slide. So this is about the physical versus online events. What's the same, what's different, what's the good, and what's the bad? So while the above steps that I just mentioned were mainly for an in-person event, a good portion of this also applies to your online event. You need to book interpreters and captioners early. You need to include an option and instruction for requesting reasonable accommodation. Third, you need to get event materials ahead of time to share with your captioners and interpreters. You may need to provide an alternate format for those with visual impairment. You need to prep moderators for how to be inclusive and accessible. You also need to make sure that you run a test with all of these accessibility features, because not everyone has knowledge of how to add caption to a Zoom meeting. Not everyone knows how to focus on an interpreter during a meeting. So we're all sort of in the same boat, that we never had to do this before, and now we're trying to figure out how to fly the plane as we are learning to fly it. Did I just say drive the plane? I meant fly the plane. So the good thing about a virtual online space is that it does remove some of the physical barriers for people with disabilities, such as having the challenge of trying to get to your venue, or perhaps the building of the venue was not physically accessible. You're now bringing the meeting to them, and that's a good thing. This is not a bad thing. This is just something to improve on. We all need to improve, or rather, we all need to learn on how to use these different accessibility features in virtual meetings. And the other thing that's challenging for us is that we are often not an organization that have a huge budget. We don't always have an in-house IT person or a tech team. We are the tech team. And sometimes technology doesn't go the way we want it. For example, yesterday, my internet went out just before I was supposed to do one of my dance classes, but I did have a contingency plan in place in case that ever happened. And now I'm back. I'm sure Bianca's quite thrilled that after I told her my internet is down, she must be thinking, oh no, what about today's webinar? Luckily, I'm here. Next slide. Okay, so now here we are approaching our 4th month of physical distancing. Things are starting to reopen, but for the arts and culture sector, the way we gather in the past may not be the way we gather in the future. It may be some time before events can take place in person, but the new reality is that a lot of our meetings and conferences and dance classes will be online. So here's a few things I want to talk about under this section is reasonable accommodations, the different platforms to do it in, how to make it accessible for those who are deaf and hard of hearing, how to make this accessible for those who are low vision or blind. So reasonable accommodation, what is it? Reasonable accommodation refers to the provision of conditions, equipment, and environment that enable an individual with a disability to effectively participate. Originally, it was a term meant for the work environment, but it has been used for healthcare and academic settings. It can also be used for any different type of disability accommodation. But let's go back to how people talk about reasonable accommodation. I gave an example of the well-doing and the description of an event they were having. They described the event as it will have live captioning. Then the next person that described their event, this was a well-meaning. The request for sign language interpreters and or card providers should be made at least 2 weeks in advance if possible. Please note that we will make every effort to secure services, but that services are subject to availability. So the language that I would use is, if you have an accessibility request, please email us and then provide the email address to a specific person. Now, requesting a sign language interpreter or a captioner, for those of you who are based in Massachusetts, you can go to the Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, or otherwise known as MCDHH. You can Google how to request an ASL interpreter or kite provider, and then MCDHH. They give information on how to request an interpreter. They do provide an interpreter referral program. You can also look into private interpreters and captioner agencies, such as Partners Interpreting. Do note that the rates tend to be higher. Go back and ask the individual who's making disability requests, an accommodation request, if they have a preference that they want a specific sign language interpreter or a specific captioner, so you can try to honor that. One of the benefits I want to point out that for when an organization hires a person with a disability, you get access to all of their networks and all of their personal contact for how over the years, for myself, I've accrued a massive amount of sign language interpreters' contact information, and for Silent Rhythm and Disability Rights Fund, both of them have been able to take advantage of my wide contact network. Now, the platforms. What's the best platform to have your meeting in? I can't actually answer that question because it depends on your meeting. It depends on the audience. There are many platforms such as Skype, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangout, Google Meet, WebEx, GoToMeeting, WhatsApp. Now, I use a good number of these, but what I tend to use the most often is Zoom and something called StreamYard. So why I like Zoom the most is because often I'm using a sign language interpreter. I want the platform that has the best video quality, and Zoom is one of the best for video quality. I also like the wide range of accessibility features that Zoom has itself. So this is a good time for those of you to look at the ways to play around with the caption, to turn it on, to turn it off, and then how to make the size different. And once again, note that I'll be describing images. Now for Zoom, I'm going to talk about the following things: guidance on communication procedures, accessibility for those who are deaf and hard of hearing, accessibility for those who are visually impaired. So some of the communication rules that you should do at the beginning of any of your online meetings is, prior to the event, provide accessibility notes in your event description, such as explaining that you're providing a sign language interpreter and captioning. Also tell them how they can pin the video of the sign language interpreter. Not everyone is tech savvy. Not everyone knows how to do these things. Make sure that you assign a facilitator for the meeting, because it can be difficult to be the tech person, the moderator, and running the troubleshooting. So try to assign different roles instead of trying to do it all yourself. Mute your microphone. Turn off your video. So the only video that should be seen is the video of the sign language interpreter and the video of the speaker. If you're using Zoom meeting, then what you do is turn off everyone's video except the interpreter and the speaker, and then go in the gallery mode. When you're in the gallery mode, if you disable the view of all non-active video participants, the only two videos you should see side by side are the interpreter and the speaker. In Zoom Webinar, which is what we're using, there are more options for how to, that we can do to create, putting the interpreter and putting the speaker in a certain way. But I feel like the majority of you are going to be using a Zoom meeting format. Okay, give the moderator training on facilitating a communication for both accessibility and time management. So ask people to put their question in the chat or QA. And that's something for you guys too, that today, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And with about 10 minutes left, we'll go ahead and read your question, and I'll do my best to answer them. When you have multiple panelists and the facilitator is going to put a question out there, the facilitator should assign who should be answering a question first. So for example, someone asked a question, how do people with disabilities advance their human rights? So I'm going to ask Bianca to go first, then Maxine, then Christian. So you save yourself a lot of time, and you save a lot of the panelists kind of looking at each other like, me, who, you? So one thing I want to note is that for many people, even sign language interpreters and captioners, using online meeting platform is something they're not used to either. So you want to help make sure that they're familiar and comfortable with the technology. And so I cannot emphasize this enough. Do a test, do a test, do a test. Put your service to the test. I just came up with that. I love Beauty and the Beast. Okay, so now we're talking about Zoom accessibility for those who are deaf and hard of hearing. So there are several different captioning tools that you can use for a Zoom meeting. There's one when you're using a third party, such as we're doing right now. We have a live person listening to the meeting and typing out the caption. Then there is a way in Zoom that you could assign someone else in your meeting to be a captioner. So I might assign Bianca to be a captioner. And Bianca can type directly into her screen, hello everyone, and then we all see that as a caption. I don't advise doing that because you have to be an incredibly fast typist, but it could be ideal if you have a one-on-one meeting with somebody on your staff, and this is a way to see the video as well as to type what you're saying. I'm going to talk next week in the webinar. It'll be robot captions and caption. So I know a lot of people have questions about captioning features and captioning tools. So save them for next week because I'll go really in depth for that. So next week's session will be focusing on those, and I just want to move on and talk about working with a sign language interpreter. So again, a reminder that interpreter might not be used to interpreting in a remote setting. So I want you to either look at my screen or look at the interpreter screen, because there's a couple of things that people need to do as interpreter if they're signing. One, to have a solid background behind them, no windows, no pictures or images. So behind me is a black curtain to give good contrast to myself. The second thing is wear clothes that contrast with your skin color. So I am a white person, but I am wearing a black shirt so that my hand pop out very easily. And you can see the same for the interpreter for today's call, who is also a white woman. And you can see that she has a dark background and dark clothes. You also want to have a high neckline, because if you have a low neckline, like a V-neck, your hand over your exposed skin will just fade in. And again, ask the interpreter and captioner to do a test. And also, it's good to have a test done with the deaf participant ahead of time to make sure it works for them. So now I'll quickly go through Zoom accessibility for those who are visually impaired. There are several types of screen readers that people who are visually impaired use. The top two are called JAWS, J-A-W-S, and the other one is VoiceOver. JAWS is the one that's on a PC, and you have to install it. VoiceOver is for any Mac devices. Any Mac devices like iPad, iPhone, your iMac, or your Mac laptop, all of those already have that built in. So play around with VoiceOver. Now, people who are visually impaired do use Doom. A lot of them really enjoy using Doom. And one of the reasons is because Doom enables keyboard shortcuts. So for example, in VoiceOver, this is the keyboard shortcut. You press Command, the Shift key, and the letter A at the same time. That mutes and unmutes the audio. So it's difficult for me or anyone who is visual impairment to try to find the microphone on their screen. This is a shortcut that they can use. There are many keyboard shortcuts. So a reminder that PowerPoints are not accessible for those who are visually impaired. Sharing your screen is not accessible to those who are visually impaired. So it's always a good idea to share a PowerPoint ahead of time and make sure that if you have images on that PowerPoint, that you include alt text directly into the image on the PowerPoint. The screen reader will read that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is a picture of Silent Rhythms Dance ASL project. So in black, the text says the dance and project, and they are horizontally. Then ASL underneath the letter A from dance, instead of going down vertically, ASL. ASL is in red color. The other letters are all in black, and it's against a white background. So what is the Dance ASL project? This is a project that I started for Silent Rhythms at the beginning of the pandemic when I could no longer teach my dance classes. And I've been thinking for a while now how many of my students with disabilities have not been going to other dance classes. I didn't want them to feel like the only place they could go was my classes. I wanted them to learn how to go swing dancing or ballroom dancing or tango. I wanted to open the world of possibilities to them to learn all these different kinds of dances. I can only be in so many places. So the idea came to me that how can I continue to provide accessible dance classes while also trying to support the local dance community. Many of those dance teachers whose studio have shut down and are not even sure when they're going to be able to reopen, and when they can reopen, what that's going to look like, and their students will come back. So the idea was that I would reach out to many of the local dance teachers and ask them to teach one class for 30 minutes. And I projected on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. There's another little ulterior motive that I had in doing this, because I provided a small stipend. So they had a motivation to follow the accessibility guideline that I gave them. They had to make sure that they wore dark colors, that they had a solid background behind them. They had to do a test with me to check the audio, to check their frame, and to check the way they teach. Because the other thing that I did was I provided an American Sign Language interpreter, and I used the app StreamYard. So this way it gave me a lot more control over moving in and out of people's video. So I had the option of easily putting one person into the broadcast studio and taking someone else out. So I was able to easily put a sign language interpreter and the dance teacher side by side. So it's been 9 weeks and we've done 9 classes. I wanted to give my students the opportunity to learn other dance classes, other dance types, while at the same time teaching the dance community how to think about accessibility and inclusion. And I hope it's a lesson they took, that when they start teaching the regular dance classes, will start thinking about how they can be inclusive of people with disabilities. Next slide. So this is a screenshot showing the video of the sign language interpreter, who is on the right, the left side, and on the right side is the dance teacher. And I also made sure that the dance teacher wore the right clothes, the right colors, and the interpreter, you can see, is wearing dark colors. I told the dance teacher that when they're dancing and demonstrating, what I asked them to do is first explain what you're going to do. So that way the focus can be on the interpreter. But then say something like, okay, now watch me. I'm going to demonstrate. So then it helps the person who is deaf move their eyes away from the video of the interpreter to the video of the teacher so that they can focus on one thing at a time. So I would tell the dance teacher, don't talk and demonstrate at the same time. Do one or the other. So they've been doing this pretty well. And I love having videos of dance classes. Even before the pandemic, I was taking a lot of dance classes myself as a student because I was trying to learn how to be a leader and not just a follower in dance classes so that I can teach a follower, no problem. But as my students were starting to advance, I could only teach the leader up to intermediate level. So I had to go back to dance class myself to learn how to teach from the leader perspective. And it was hard for me to see everything that was happening. I can only see a very small window. I can only look at maybe the eye or the finger or the feet, not all of them at the same time. But at the end of the class, I took a video of what the teacher demonstrated, and then later I can put this teacher who's now like from 5'7" to now 5 inches, and that was so much easier. And then I could repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and try to make sure that I catch everything that she was doing. So let me go quickly through a couple of things for creating an accessible dance class. The same tips from before about wearing the right color. So dance teachers should be wearing a solid background of colors. They should also have a solid background behind them. There should be a contrast. So it should not be a black curtain and black clothes. You do want a dance teacher's body to pop out better. So if they are a person of color, they should be wearing any color but black so that their body pops out better. The other thing is I do recommend trying to do your classes with Facebook Live or YouTube Live because you can take advantage of the captioning option, which I will talk about next week. So hold your questions on that. I already mentioned that you want to alternate between talking and demonstrating. The other tip is to write the terms. So not everyone knows what all of these terms mean. So one of the dance classes that I teach is on casino, and they have all these different names for different moves, such as sombrero, adios, hagabuya. And unfortunately, I did not tell the interpreter or the captioner those words, so they're not sure how to spell it, but that is an example of why you ask the dance teacher ahead of time, what are the terms that you are going to be teaching, so then the interpreter can be ready. And sometimes the interpreter might not know how to spell the word, especially if the word is in another language like Spanish. Okay, the other thing that's helpful is explain the music for people who are deaf. Also, if possible, sign the count. So you may say like, okay, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3. Backs up 5, 6, 7. So that people can understand that every step matches to a count. So I'll do side step, and side step with my feet going to the left, I would do 1, 2, 3, and then 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. So I try to teach the dance teachers how to count with numbers. I also explain to them that it's helpful when they're changing different direction, moving forward, point forward. If they're going to move backward, point backwards. If they're going to move to the left, point to the left. If they're going to move to the right, point to the right. I also tell them not to focus too much on saying, I'm moving to the left or I'm moving to the right, because their left is our right, it gets very confusing. And a lot of times interpreters might sometimes just gesture. So if the video of the dance teacher is like my hand right here on my left, she'll kind of just gesture to tell you to look at the video of the dance teacher. Okay, the next slide, please. So I'm wrapping up here so that I can give you guys a chance to ask your question. I just want to leave you with these 3 philosophies that I've been talking about the last few weeks. The first one is the door philosophy. Keep your door open and put the welcome mat out to make people with disabilities feel welcome to come to your space. 2, think about what do you see, what do you hear, and make sure that others understand what you see and what you hear. The third, and this is from today, give your driver a map and a GPS so they know where to go. So providing information to captioners and interpreters ahead of time will help them in driving the car to your destination and making sure that they know where they're going. So I'm going to wrap it up right here and just say that now you know some of the ways to reduce information barriers. So I hope that you learned today, that you open your mind and your heart and your eyes and can think about how to make the world a bigger place for those of us with disabilities. So if you want to type up your questions right now, it's a perfect opportunity for Bianca to come back and read these questions to me, and I am going to sip some water.
Thank you so much, Carrie. While we give people a moment to come up with their questions, we have one in right now. I would just like to take 1 minute to thank everyone who made this possible today. Again, my name is Bianca Morrow. I'm on the Lowell Cultural Council. Carrie Thompson has been the author of this presentation. She's the Executive Director of Silent Rhythms. Maxine Farkas, the Chairwoman of the LCC. Christian Hernandez from the City of Lowell and the LCC Administrator for running our slides today. Rachel Judelson for the ASL interpretation. Sherry Majeski for the closed captions. And Jane Long from BRM Production Management, helping us keep everything running smoothly. So with that said, I'm going to go to Sam's question for you, Carrie. Sam Gould from the Open Door Theater asks, Carrie, how do you feel about Google Meet? We had some luck using it as the captions work well. The downside was that we could not spotlight the ASL interpreter and the speaker/signer. The viewer had to choose their own spotlight viewer.
That's an excellent question, Sam. And so I don't actually use Google Meet or Hangout too much. And one of the reasons why for that is just my own preference, because as a person with a visual limitation, it's difficult for me to see a sign language interpreter on a screen. I tend to look at captions, and a reminder that once again, I'm looking at the caption of what people are saying separately on my iPad to my left. So that's why you see my head moving to the side. With Google Meet and Microsoft Teams, both of them have captions, but the captions are really small and they're only like 1 or 2 lines at a time. You cannot move up or down. So I tend to like another device, such as it's an app called Otter, OTTER.ai. And sometimes I use that as it does live transcribing, but I can see the transcripts as they come in and move them up and down. I like that. In terms of whether to spotlight the interpreter or to focus on the caption, it depends on who is in your meeting. If you have somebody that you know who is deaf or hard of hearing, ask them what their preference is.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, another one from a follow-up question from Sam. She asks, can I use otter.ai to set up my meetings?
It depends. There is a platform for Otter.ai as a webinar. I have not used it personally, so I cannot say whether it's good or quality. I do know that sometimes it's more expensive. And so the other thing is that during your meeting, you can tell people that if they want more caption option, that they themselves could also download Otter.ai on their phone.
Great, thank you so much. Anyone else? We have about 3 minutes until we're encroaching into your weekend. So if no one else has anything, then I would like to thank you all again for taking the time out of your Friday to join us here. And please join us next Friday at 10 a.m. for the final webinar in this series. And the topic will be robots, captions, and craptions. Thanks, Carrie, for making me say that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
All right, you too, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.